Hey everyone. Today we talk about a ghost story from the Cold War. It's a story you might have heard in different forms, a conspiracy whispered online. It goes something like this. The Bank of China's gold was stolen and sent to Taiwan in 1948. Then the West hit China with an economic embargo that didn't end until 1971, and all of China's money abroad was frozen solid until 1973. It's a simple, powerful story. A story of theft, punishment, and a nation being held down. And like any good ghost story, it's based on something real. But the truth, as always, is a lot messier, a lot more complicated, and frankly, a lot more interesting than the conspiracy lets on. So let's start with the gold. Did a massive amount of gold get moved from the Bank of China to Taiwan in 1948? Yes, absolutely. Between late 1948 and into 1949, as the Civil War was clearly turning in favor of Mao's communists, the Nationalist government, the Kuomintang or KMT, made a decision. They moved the country's reserves of gold, silver, and foreign currency to Taiwan. The operation was so secret that according to Dr. Wu Xing-Young, author of The Archives of Gold, it was personally masterminded by his father, Lieutenant General Wu Song-ching, who took verbal orders directly from Chiang Kai-shek, bypassing the normal government channels. A British journalist, George Vine, then working for the North China Daily News, unwittingly became one of the first outsiders to witness the move. Looking out his window at the Peace Hotel in Shanghai in the early hours of December 2, 1948, he saw soldiers with loaded rifles sealing off the streets as men hauled heavy boxes from the Bank of China to a waiting vessel on the Bund. We're talking about a staggering amount, with estimates suggesting as many as 200 tons of gold and silver were moved in total. But was it stolen? Well, that's where the conflict really begins, because it depends entirely on who you ask. From the KMT's perspective, they were the legitimate, internationally recognized government of China. They weren't stealing anything. They were moving national assets to a secure province to keep them out of the hands of what they saw as an illegitimate rebellion. For them, it was a responsible act of governance in a time of crisis. But from the Communist Party's point of view, it was grand larceny. It was a defeated regime looting the national treasury, stealing the wealth of the Chinese people as they fled the mainland. Both sides have a legitimate claim to their version of the story, and that's the first layer of nuance we need to understand. This wasn't a simple bank heist. It was an act of a collapsing government in the middle of a brutal civil war. That gold, by the way, was absolutely critical. It stabilized Taiwan's economy and currency in the 1950s, combating hyperinflation and forming the bedrock of its future prosperity. Now let's talk about the embargo, the idea that the West collectively decided to economically strangle China. This part of the story is also mostly true, but the timeline is key. The real trigger wasn't the Civil War, but China's entry into the Korean War. In December 1950, the United States, under President Truman, imposed a total economic embargo on the People's Republic of China. A few months later, on May 18, 1951, the United Nations passed Resolution 500, recommending an embargo on strategic materials like arms, ammunition, and implements of war, atomic energy materials, petroleum, and transportation materials of strategic value. But here's where it gets complicated. The West wasn't a monolith. The U.S. took a very hard line, a total embargo, and used legislation like the Battle Act to pressure others into compliance by threatening to cut off foreign aid. But other Western countries, like the United Kingdom and Japan, eventually started to peel away. The British, for instance, were keen to protect their economic interests, and Hong Kong. Under heavy American pressure, they initially complied, but by May 1957, the UK officially broke ranks, announcing it would no longer observe the stricter China differential in trade and would instead apply the same, less restrictive rules it used for the Soviet bloc. Japan, whose business community saw trade with China as vital for its own economic recovery, followed suit in July 1957. As a headline in the New York Times from that era might have put it, Allies divided on China trade. The 1971 date is dead on, though, for the United States. That's when President Nixon, as part of his grand strategy to re-engage with China, officially ended that 21-year trade embargo. So it wasn't a coordinated Western plot that lasted for 2 decades. It was a U.S.-led policy that other nations followed for a while before their own economic interests started to take precedence. Finally, we get to the frozen assets, the claim that all of China's foreign assets were frozen until 1973. This part of the story gets a bit shaky. The assets were indeed frozen in December 1950, at the same time as the embargo. President Truman declared a national emergency and blocked all Chinese assets in the United States, and China, in turn, froze U.S. assets within its borders. But the unfreezing didn't happen in 1973. While Nixon's visit in '72 opened the door and the U.S. and China established liaison offices in '73, the actual unfreezing of assets was a much longer, much more drawn-out process. The agreement to settle the claims and unblock the assets wasn't signed until May 11, 1979, by U.S. Treasury Secretary W. Michael Blumenthal. In that deal, the U.S. agreed to unfreeze some $80.5 million of Chinese assets, and in return, China agreed to pay $80.5 million to settle $197 million of American claims. As Blumenthal told the Washington Post at the time, the deal was very good and fair, noting that trying to settle the claims on an individual basis would have taken 10 years in litigation. The official unblocking didn't happen until January 1980. So we're off by about 7 years, which is a significant detail. It shows that even after the political handshake, the financial plumbing of diplomacy takes a long, long time to clear. But here's the most important concluding thought, the part that often gets left out of the narrative of victimhood and conspiracy. While the freezing of assets was a real act of economic pressure, its overall impact on China's development was probably not as catastrophic as it sounds. Think about it. In 1950, China was a nation just emerging from decades of war and internal conflict. It was an economic ruin. It simply didn't have that many overseas assets to be frozen in the first place. The figure at the time was $76 million. A lot of money, for sure, but as one commentator on the BBC noted, not a nation-breaking sum. The real economic damage came from the trade embargo, from being cut off from Western technology and markets. The frozen assets were more symbolic, a political statement. So using this story to prove that the West has always been trying to hold China down to stir up this sense of historical grievance is just not necessary. The history is complex enough on its own. It's a story of civil war, of shifting global alliances, and of the slow, grinding process of 2 world powers feeling their way out of a deep freeze. The real story is always more powerful than the ghost story.